This is the land we are talking about. 65 acres of waterfront property on the central coast of North Carolina, where the News River meets the Pamlico Sound. The Reels family had lived here for over a century. They fished these waters, built homes along the shore, and raised generations of children who ran barefoot from one aunt's house to another. During the Jim Crow era, this was the only beach in the county where black families could swim without being harassed. And then their own uncle sold it out from under them. What happened next would land two brothers in jail for 8 years, despite the fact that they were never convicted of a single crime. This is the story of how Melvin Davis and Lecurtis Reels lost their family's land through legal trickery, how they refused to give it up, and why thousands of black families across the South have faced the exact same nightmare. 1911, and a man named Elijah Reels did something remarkable. Just one generation removed from slavery, he purchased 65 acres of marshy waterfront land along what would become known as Silver Dollar Road in Carteret County, North Carolina. At the time, nobody wanted this land. It was swampy, difficult to farm, and miles from anywhere important. But Elijah Reels saw something others didn't. He farmed watermelons, beets, and peas on this soil. Churches held tent revivals on the waterfront, and over the decades, the Reels family grew and built their lives here. Elijah's son Mitchell took over the property and bought it again from the county after a 1944 tax forfeiture. Mitchell was cautious about the legal system. Like many black Americans of his era, he had good reason not to trust white courts in the South. So when Mitchell died in 1970, he left no will. And that decision, made out of distrust of a system that had never protected his people, would prove to be catastrophic. When someone dies without a will, their property becomes what is called heirs property. Think of it like owning stock in a company. Every descendant gets an interest in the land, but nobody holds clear title. Dozens of Mitchell Reels' children and grandchildren now co-owned the property together. Among them was his daughter Gertrude, a tough, quiet woman who packed tobacco in her cheek and didn't suffer fools. People called her Mrs. Big Stuff. She raised her children on this land, including 2 sons named Melvin Davis and Lecurtis Reels. Melvin, with his loose black curls combed into a ponytail, built a life on this water. He ran a club called Fantasy Island on the property and made his living as a shrimper, teaching young men in the community how to work the boats and pull up crab pots. Lecurtis worked as a brick mason and spent years building a house near the river's edge, just steps from his mother's home. They had every reason to believe this land would be theirs forever. But Mitchell Reels had a brother living in New Jersey, a man named Shedrick Reels, though everyone called him Shade. And Shade had other plans. In 1978, Shade pulled a deed out of nowhere. He claimed his father Elijah had wanted him to have 13 acres of the waterfront property. There was just one problem. The deed was dated 1950. That was 6 years after Elijah had already lost the land to taxes and Mitchell had repurchased it from the county. The Reels family immediately hired a local attorney to fight the claim. They went to court. They provided evidence that Mitchell's 1944 purchase was the legitimate ownership. And they won. the court ruled in favor of the family living on Silver Dollar Road. But Shade wasn't finished. He turned to an obscure North Carolina law called the Torrens Act. And this is where things get truly disturbing. The Torrens Act was originally designed to help clear up messy land titles. But in practice, it became something else entirely. Under this law, Shade didn't have to go before a formal court. He didn't have to follow the normal rules of evidence. He simply had to prove adverse possession, the idea that he had occupied the land for years against the owner's wishes, to a lawyer appointed by the court, a lawyer that Shade himself paid. As one land broker in Carteret County put it, it's a legal way to steal land. The Reels family showed up to fight the claim. Gertrude testified that she had been living on this land her entire life. Her son Melvin explained that he had built his club on this waterfront. They left the hearing believing they had won again. But something strange happened. The lawyer examining the case sided with Shade anyway. The family's own attorney, Claude Wheatley, signed a certification saying the family had no objections to Shade's claim. The Reels say they never agreed to any such thing. By the time the family realized what had happened, the 1-year window to appeal a Torrens decision had already passed. They missed it by 2 years. Shade now legally owned 13 acres of the most valuable portion of the Reels family's land, the waterfront, the beach where black families had gathered for generations, the spot where Melvin ran his club and LeCurtis had built his home. And then Shade sold it. In 1985, the waterfront property changed hands and eventually ended up with a company called Adams Creek Associates. The plan was to build condominiums on the water, luxury housing for wealthy buyers in an area that was rapidly becoming a tourist destination for rich folks from elsewhere. Melvin and LeCurtis refused to leave. They had lived on this land their entire lives. They had built their homes here with their own hands, and they believed, with good reason, that it had been stolen from them through legal trickery. For the next 20 years, Adams Creek Associates took the brothers to court again and again. The company wanted Melvin and LeCurtis to tear down their homes, vacate the property, and sign documents promising never to return. The brothers said no. In 2004, a judge issued an order demanding they leave. They refused. In 2011, another judge set those same demands in a contempt of court order. Either tear down your homes, leave the property, and promise never to come back, or go to jail. Melvin was 64 years old. LeCurtis was 53 years old. They chose jail. On that day in March 2011, Melvin and LeCurtis stood before the court and refused to abandon the only home they had ever known. The judge sent them to the Carteret County Jail in Beaufort, North Carolina, where they would remain for the next 8 years. 8 years for contempt of civil court, without ever being convicted of a crime. Their niece Kim Duhon explained their thinking. They made a vow never to leave this property or to lose the property, and they are standing by that vow. Inside the jail, the brothers continued to fight. They filed appeals. They refused to sign any document that would give up their claim to the land. Their attorney argued that holding them indefinitely was unconstitutional, but court after court ruled against them. Meanwhile, the land they had fought for sat empty. Adams Creek Associates never built a single condo. No shovel ever broke ground. The waterfront property that had caused so much suffering just sat there, unused, while two men rotted in jail for refusing to give it up. The brothers' case eventually attracted national attention. ProPublica and The New Yorker published an investigation in 2019 that exposed not just their story, but a pattern of black land loss across the South that had been going on for over a century. Between 1910 and 1997, African Americans lost 90% of their farmland in the United States. That is not a typo. 90%. Much of this land was taken through legal mechanisms like the Torrens Act and partition sales, where a developer could buy the interest of a single heir and force the entire property to be sold at auction. The sales were often quick, poorly advertised, and fetched below market prices. In 1992, the NAACP accused officials on Daufuskie Island in South Carolina of raising property taxes by 700% in a single decade, specifically to push out black families. On nearby Hilton Head, heirs' property holdings fell from thousands of acres to an estimated 200. As historian David Cekielski told reporters, "You cannot talk to an African American family who owned land in those counties and not find a story where they feel like land was taken from them against their will through legal trickery." 14 states have passed legislation to reform this system. North Carolina is not one of them. The Torrens Act remains on the books. In February 2019, after nearly 8 years behind bars, Melvin Davis and LeCurtis Reels were finally released. Their attorney, James Hairston, successfully argued for their freedom, and Judge Joshua Willey ordered them set free. But the ruling came with a bitter twist. The brothers were still forbidden from returning to their land. They were still technically required to tear down their homes, and if they set foot on the property their great-grandfather had purchased in 1911, they could be arrested for criminal trespassing and sent right back to jail. Melvin, now 78 years old, stood at the edge of Silver Dollar Road after his release and looked out at the water where he had spent his life shrimping. It was the first time since 2011 he had seen the sun glisten over the Pamlico Sound. "I shrimped off of this water, and I've been on this land all of my days," he said. "I'm not letting it up." The family still owns more than 50 acres of the original property, including a church and cemetery where their ancestors are buried. But Melvin fears that losing any parcel to development could cause property taxes to skyrocket, eventually forcing the entire family off the land their great-grandfather bought one generation after slavery. In 2023, acclaimed filmmaker Raoul Peck released a documentary called Silver Dollar Road about the Reels family's struggle. Peck, known for his Oscar-nominated film I Am Not Your Negro, spent years documenting the family's fight and the broader pattern of black land dispossession. The film features Gertrude, the family matriarch, as well as Melvin and LeCurtis' sister Mamie and their niece Kim. It shows what the land meant to generations of black families who had nowhere else to feel safe, and what was lost when the legal system failed to protect them. The story of the Reels brothers is not unique. It is a story that has played out thousands of times across the American South. Wherever black families managed to accumulate wealth in the form of land only to have it stripped away through legal mechanisms designed to favor those with money and power. Melvin Davis is now 83 years old. He still lives near Silver Dollar Road, still looking out at the water where he built his life. He never got justice. The uncle who betrayed his family is long dead. The developers who bought stolen land still own it. But he also never gave up. He spent 8 years in jail rather than sign away his birthright. And in the end, he walked out of that jailhouse with his head held high. My name is Michael. Stay safe out there, and as always, thank you for watching.